Welcome to episode 6 of Real Health Radio.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. Health advice that's more than just about how you look. And here's your host, Chris Sandel.
So, hi everybody, welcome to the show. And on today's show, it's an interview with Isabel Foxen Duke. Isabel is a certified health coach and emotional eating expert. She helps women make peace with their bodies so they can stop obsessing about food and get back to living awesome lives. After years of trying to overcome emotional eating through traditional and alternative approaches, Isabel discovered some radical new ways to get women over their food issues once and for all. Isabel's been featured in the Huffington Post, Elle magazine, XO Jane, and has even been praised by Ricky Lake. More information can be found about her on isabelfoxenduke.com. And I've been following Isabel for about a year now. She had a video training series called Stop Fighting Food. She's actually about to re-release that again this year. But I came across it last year, sort of sometime in the sort of August, September time. Something you maybe not know about me, I'm really into music. I have been for a very long time. That is kind of both bands as well as electronic music. I used to work for a website called Resident Advisor, which is kind of like the Bible on sort of electronic music. It was set up by a friend of mine. Of the holidays that I've been on over the summer this year, so most of them been to sort of music festivals or to play golf. But yeah, music is a really big part of my life. And with the video training series that Isabel has, she used a piece of music by a band or an artist called Moderat. And it's from an album that I sort of really love. And I find that sort of so much of the music that people use in sort of videos and different stuff online just feels like there's not a lot of thought that's gone into it, and it feels sort of often totally inappropriate. So it was really sort of refreshing to watch this video and sort of hear this music. And I know it's probably not the best way to describe that's how I got into her, but it was why I kind of initially started following her. But then from there, obviously, she has to be then providing good content for me to keep going, and that's what I found out. She just has such great things to say. I think she's got a really good take on things, and the more I continued to sort of read what she had to say, listen to her on podcasts, the more I've sort of really got into her take on things. And I think she's just someone who is sort of really super smart. She's one of those people who kind of simultaneously makes you feel sort of smarter and dumber at the same time, or at least that's how I feel. I feel when I chat with her, I'm smarter because she's sort of very super supportive, but I also feel dumber because she's just so widely read, sort of understands things on such a kind of deeper level. And so the sort of underconfident part of me is like, I just wish I could be able to speak like her or understand things like her. So we cover a lot as part of the podcast. We look at sort of why binging and emotional eating really stems from sort of dieting and weight expectations. We look at sort of fallacies around sort of weight and control, the problems with sort of emotional deprivation. So not just physical deprivation, but emotional deprivation. We talk about the sort of this new documentary that she's involved in called Fattitude, and also her Stop Fighting the Food program. So I hope you enjoy today's podcast. Going to sit back and enjoy. So welcome to the show, Isabel.
Thank you, Chris. I'm very excited to be here.
That's great. And so look, to start off with, why don't you just give me a bit of background about you and about how you got into sort of the health and sort of body image movement?
Sure. So, this is like one of those things where there's sort of like the long and short story. I always say that at the beginning of every podcast when this is the first question.
Yeah.
But basically, I got into this because of my own personal struggles, which I think is a very common answer to that question. It just so happens that my particular struggle was not, some sort of, chronic illness that I tried to heal with food. My particular struggle was that I was completely obsessed with food and binge eating and eating emotionally all the time and couldn't figure out why. And just food was compromising my sanity. I was thinking about it far more than the average person. I felt compulsive around food in a way that I didn't understand. And this was from a very young age on. Like, I always felt like my hunger was insatiable. Like, if I didn't hold myself back from eating everything in sight, I would. And I think that obviously, now later in life, I really connect this with a long history of dieting. I was put on my first diet when I was about 3 years old. So food was always this temptation. It was always this seductive thing. It was always this reward. It was this treat. It was this thing that I wasn't supposed to have, but was, holding myself back from and like constantly trying to control my hungers around, both emotional and physical hungers. So that's really how I ended up getting into the health and wellness world, was through my own personal, just struggling with it. And I think one of the reasons, I think a lot of people, it's almost unfortunate that they end up getting into this industry because they are struggling themselves and they don't necessarily have a solution. One of the reasons that I actually decided to make this a career and really get into this professionally was because I couldn't find any other professionals that had a solution. So when I actually sort of came to something new that was like, holy shit, this might actually work. This might actually be the answer, in quotes. I did feel this sort of obligation to share it. I had some of the best clinical treatment for binge eating and, other various forms of disordered eating that exist, like the fanciest rehabs, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I was very privileged to be able, my parents were sending me to these places at young ages. And then I obviously continued my own treatment into adulthood. But, I really was seeing the best of the best practitioners, and no one was really giving me a solid solution to either emotional eating or binge eating. The answer didn't really seem to exist, or when somebody said that they hadn't had an answer, it didn't work for me. So that was really the real reason why I got into this industry, was because when I actually, after decades of trying to figure it out, felt like I came to something that actually was a solution for me, I felt pretty compelled to share it with the world.
Sure. And what was that sort of disconnect between what they were doing and it wasn't working versus what you kind of came to and realized, actually, this is the way that I want to do it?
Well, ultimately, and this is, I don't know how much of this will be news to people out there listening, but ultimately most binge eating in particular, and a lot of emotional eating, stems from dieting, obviously. Like most non-dieters, people who have no restrictive histories, they don't tend to eat emotionally that much. And binge eating in particular is just straight up a reaction to deprivation. I mean, clinicians seem to understand this. However, what not a lot of clinicians are making the leap to, it's almost like we understand that diets don't work. We admit that diets don't work. We understand that diets create binge eating, and in a lot of instances are what are creating emotional eating as well. However, we still believe the general party line is if you are eating normally, you will be thin. You will have a specific kind of body type. You will be BMI 25 or lower. And that was, I think, ultimately the biggest problem, was that I was always trying to attack my binge eating and emotional eating problem from this desire to change my body. And because of that, and I didn't understand why I wasn't getting fixed, I didn't understand why nothing was changing. But the reality of the situation is that I was, in many different conscious and even subconscious ways, never able to not really restrict my food, never able to really let go of trying to control my food, because it was always all about weight loss at the end of the day. It was always all about trying to get thinner. Even when I was doing things, and I've talked about this a lot on my blog, but like intuitive eating, which I think is an amazing step forward for clinicians to be, helping women eat more intuitively and listen to their bodies for direction around food rather than external diets. I was approaching intuitive eating from a diet mentality by virtue of the fact that I was approaching intuitive eating from this, if I do this correctly, I will get thin place. And it was that way of thinking that actually kept me, even though I had the best intentions to like listen to my body and, I thought that I was doing everything right to eat quote unquote normally, because it was coming from a place of my body's not good enough. I have to, this is what I have to do to get thin. I was sort of still subconsciously trying to control and in some ways restricting my food always, which ultimately led to binge eating and emotional eating a lot. So it was sort of this weird, there's sort of this weird kind of, it's not a catch-22, but kind of like disconnect in the clinical world. I think that still exists today. But as far as like treatment for binge eating and emotional eating is concerned, most people are saying, if you get your binge eating and emotional eating under control, you will be a certain size. And now I know from being influenced by people like Linda Bacon and sort of the health at every size community that that's not necessarily true. And making that the goal, what I sort of realized for myself personally, and this is really the core of my message, by making weight loss the goal of ending binge eating or emotional eating, or even just not even necessarily ending those things, but really trying to like grapple with and deal with those things, you're self-sabotaging, because there's no way to not sort of, again, consciously or subconsciously restrict or try to control your food, which is what's causing binge eating to begin with, if you are doing it for the purpose of trying to get thin or control your body. And so that was sort of like this big aha moment, was like, as long as my attempts at dealing with emotional and binge eating were coming from a place of my body's not good enough, I need to, if I do this correctly, I'll lose weight, I was still in diet mentality and I was still going to get the same results. It wasn't until I actually let go of, and when I say, I'm going to step back for a second, when I say diet mentality, the reason why diet mentality screws people over is also because of just you're setting yourself up for this constant like reward punishment relationship with food. You're setting yourself up for this constant self-criticism around food and like judgment around your food choices every day. Those things are really forms of what I call, emotional restriction that ultimately I think also lead to emotional eating and binge eating all the time. So basically, I think the biggest difference between me, the ultimate difference between me and every other, emotional eating and binge eating coach out there, although some of them are changing and the tune really is changing to incorporate more health at every size kinds of principles, ultimately is I look at emotional eating and binge eating, and I believe the only real solution that will ever work has to be a truly body positive solution, meaning it has to come from a place of, I want to heal my relationship with food so that I can become sane, not because my body's not good enough the way it is, or because I believe that I will be thin if I do X, Y, and Z thing with food correctly, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, totally. And look, when I'm working with clients, like, one of the big things I'm always saying is like, we are not going to be using your weight as a yardstick. Like, I want you to be using intuitive eating for everything else. Like, how is your sleep? How is your memory? How's your concentration? How's your digestion? Like, let's look at all of those things, because they're the useful feedback. What's happening with your weight is really just not that important. And when people come and see me, I make a guarantee that if people are unhappy with my results, that I will refund them. But the one thing I never guarantee is weight loss. And I'm very upfront with people about that. Is like, I don't know what will happen with your weight. Often, and most of the time when people start with me, they do put on weight. Normally by the time we end up, they're back at the weight that they started at, but they're now eating lots more food than they were before, and they're much sort of more in control in terms of not being crazy around it and just kind of getting on with their life. But totally. I really want people to get away from the using that weight as a yardstick, because I think that's really the only yardstick people use when they're really honest about it. True. They tell themselves that it's about health. But when you peel that back and you say, what, actually what you're doing isn't healthy for you, they still want to do it because actually weight is the real motivator.
100%. And I think that there's a lot of this whole health versus weight conversation brings up this whole other topic, which is, a lot of people are saying, I think that people assume that weight and health are the same thing when they're not, right? Like, and I think that this is one of the reasons why the clinical community is so confused and why clinical eating disorder treatment a lot of times can be confusing for people, because the clinical world is really trapped in this, okay, well, I am being told by the entire medical community that being healthful means being a certain weight. But we obviously, are seeing more and more in research that is not necessarily true. And I think that that's one of the reasons why, a lot of clinicians, a lot of clinical eating disorder treatments are, they're kind of sending conflicting messages. They're like, don't care about your weight, but don't worry, when you don't care about your weight, you'll be this size, or this size was healthy, or et cetera, et cetera. So I think, it's a little bit challenging. And unfortunately, I think that it'll be really, a lot of eating disorder treatment is being stifled by the sort of general consensus in the medical community that being healthy means being a certain size, when we kind of know more and more, and there's just increasing evidence to support the idea that that is not necessarily true, and that weight and health are actually two separate things, and that people are not all built the same. We're not all iPhone 6s. We're not all supposed to necessarily be the same weight. And this is like a huge topic of conversation that we need to be having more broadly in various clinical settings, I believe.
Right. And in terms of, from my perspective, dieting seems to be just like one of the worst things that people can do with their relationship with food. And
and their health and their physical health.
Oh, totally. But in terms of sort of dieting leading to sort of binging and that kind of binge diet cycle, from your perspective, is sort of weight the main driver as part of that, or are there other components as well?
It is, on a superficial level, it is 100% weight, right? Like, people don't generally restrict their food, like from a calorie perspective, unless they're trying to lose weight. They might say it's about health, but ultimately they're just confusing weight and health in that sense. I don't think anyone tries to restrict their calories unless they are concerned about their weight in some capacity, either trying to lose it or not wanting to gain it or something to that effect. That being said, you're begging a different question, right? Which is, why do people want to lose weight to begin with, is a much deeper psychological and sociological question. So when people say, do people screw around with their food just because they want to lose weight? The superficial answer is no one restricts their food unless they're trying to fuck with their weight. Like, that's the superficial answer. The deeper answer is, why do people want to control their weight to begin with? That has psychological implications, right? Like, I want to lose weight because I believe that when I, get to X pounds, I'll have, the X, Y, and Z social benefits, right? I will find the love of my life. My boss will take me more seriously. My family will get off my back, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. No one cares about weight loss in a vacuum. We care about weight loss because what we make weight loss mean, because of what we think the consequences of our weight are going to be in the world. Some of which actually have validity, unfortunately, because we live in a world that is weight discriminating, and that's real, and that's a really big problem. And I don't think that we're going to actually find a solution to disordered eating, disordered thinking, diet binge cycling. I'm not sure a real solution to that problem is going to exist as long as our society and our culture is as weight discriminating as it is. Especially right now, it's really become more and more aggressively weight discriminating, even over the past 20, 30 years. It's just sort of exponentially become more weight discriminating. But some of them are not necessarily based in reality. Some of them are sort of kind of more like neurotic or obsessive, or like coming from like a psychological place that might not necessarily be in line with rationality or rational thinking, because when we feel out of control in different areas of our lives, it's on some level we think that it's easier to make it about food and our weight. Like, if my partner wants to leave me, it's a lot easier to say, oh, it's because I'm fat, I guess I should go on a diet to fix it, than actually to grapple with the fact of the matter that might be just that, rejection happens and it's painful, and it might not necessarily be a solution to that. So, I think that's sort of the sort of threefold answer to that question is, yes, it's always about weight for the most part. The deeper question is, why do people want to control their weight to begin with? that's psychological and cultural and sociological and has much more like greater implications for it, some of which are based in social realities that are very unfortunate and basically, really about bias and discrimination. And the other is, kind of how we try to feel in control in an out of control world, right? Like it's much easier to make our pain about our weight and make the answer to every emotional problem we have a diet than to actually face loss, rejection, other kinds of emotional pain that maybe we can't do anything about other than feel.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you on that. What a clients say when I'm working with them is that there's so much that I do that has absolutely nothing to do with food and body image in a kind of a real obvious way. It's dealing with so many other areas of their life that actually are the real kind of crux of what's going on. And people, as you say, they want to kind of make it about their body and make it about food, but actually that's not what it's really about. That's kind of a mask, or it's sort of dealing with it on a superficial level. And then when you start to actually look at what's going underneath, that's the stuff that really needs to be dealt with.
Totally. Like you will never fix your romantic life by going on a diet, in my opinion. Despite the fact that like there may be these cultural and social realities, at the end of the day, like people get married at every size, every day, all day long, right? Like if you are struggling in your relationship, there's probably something going on outside of your weight, but we tend to make it about our weight because that just seems easier, right? Going on a diet seems like a really simple solution to these much bigger problems that we don't necessarily have solutions for. What's ironic about it is that obviously diets don't work. And then, they don't actually end up even producing the fake superficial solutions that we think they're going to produce or that they're supposed to produce. And then we end up just getting into the cycle of like self-hatred and like, more extreme dieting and more extreme rebelling. And it's just a vicious cycle that is kind of based on two myths. One, the myth that we can control other circumstances in our life with our weight. That's fallacy number one. Not true, not a thing, yet people totally convince themselves of it so that they feel like they have some place, something that they can do with their sort of emotional discomforts or uncertainties. And then the second fallacy is not only can I control the rest of the world with my weight, but I can control my weight myself. That also is not necessarily true, right? Like we think not only that going on a diet is the solution to whatever emotional problem, but that going on a diet is actually going to get us the results that we want. Going on a diet itself doesn't work. So it's two fallacies. It's two things that don't work, two like false senses of control. And they are both working in tandem to essentially create a perfect storm, which is, where we see a lot of disordered eating and dysfunctional eating coming from.
Yeah, and I've come across clients who have actually been successful in getting the kind of quote-unquote body that they want. But the problem is it's then, wow, I've got to do all of this to kind of keep it up. And there's never a way of kind of being able to enjoy it because there's that sense of I'm hanging on by a thread here.
Totally.
And so it is this kind of like real hollow victory when someone then gets there.
Yeah, it's also every time somebody says that, I'm always a little bit, I'm always a little bit skeptical also of like, how long can you hang on by a thread? Do you know what I mean? Like everyone can hang on by a thread, but how long can you hang on by a thread? So when we say diets don't work, it's also really important to talk about sort of the like long term, like what that actually means in reality. Like what are we talking about? Like diets don't work for how long? Diets work for almost everyone in the short term. They work for almost no one in the long term. And I think that that's really true. I mean, I said this actually in a podcast recently. Like, I know so many people who are like diagnosed anorexics who are able to like, get to extremely, extremely low weights through force and will, only to end up, falling into binge eating years later. Like it's this question, and that amount of time is going to be different for different people. And also that amount of time tends to go down with every subsequent diet attempt, right? So when I was younger, I could lose 10 pounds, 20 pounds on a diet. And of course I would gain it back, but at least I could lose it the first time, right? In my head. Now, eventually I got to a place where over time, with each subsequent diet attempt, my ability to stick to a diet was like lessened. So I could, when I was 15, I could stick to a diet for 30 days. When I was, 18, I could only stick to a diet for 10 days. And then, eventually I got to a point where, like, I literally couldn't even think about dieting without wanting to shove my mouth with brownies. Like, it got progressively harder and harder and harder to hang on by a thread, which actually is an evolutionary function. That makes biological sense that it's more and more challenging to forcibly starve yourself over time. It makes sense. That's what probably kept us alive back in the day,
Yeah.
So this question, when we talk about diets don't work and really talk about the definition of success, we also have to think about timeframes here and what that means as far as, like, I think, in the long term, which statistically I think is something like 3 years, it's like 97% of people cannot maintain, restrictive behaviors with food for more than 3 years. Even that statistic is a little weird because, again, it's like an average. It's always different for everyone. Everyone has different experiences. But in the long term, I think that the trend that we're really seeing, the reality of the situation is, like, almost everyone loses their shit eventually.
Yeah. No, and I think that is entirely correct. And so, like, outside of dieting, sort of what are sort of other things that people are consistently doing that are sort of making them feel crazy around food?
Well, again, what's the definition of dieting, right? So dieting doesn't necessarily have to mean, like, I'm on Weight Watchers, I'm on Atkins, I'm doing the South Beach diet, right? Like, that doesn't necessarily, we don't necessarily have to define a diet that way. So I think that diets are what are making people crazy around food entirely. I think diets are the full-on problem. And of course, body image is a problem by virtue of the fact that body image is what's, basically making people go on these diets, right? But ultimately, to me, if no one was ever on a diet, no one would ever have, like, binge eating, emotional eating issues, really. The question is, what's the definition of a diet? I don't define diet by saying, Weight Watchers or Atkins or South Beach. For me, a definition of a diet means essentially I have a specific way of eating that I'm emotionally attached to. Meaning, like, I am, if I don't eat a specific way, whatever that specific way is, maybe that specific way is I only eat when I'm hungry and stop when I'm full, which most people would not call a diet. But if you're thinking about it, again, with diet mentality, like, I have to eat when I'm hungry and stop when full, or else, right? Or else I will lose my shit, or else I will feel badly about myself, or else I will judge and criticize myself, or my self-esteem is somehow attached to eating in that particular kind of way. That is what I consider to be a diet, right? When we are emotionally attached to eating a certain way, when our self-esteem is dependent on eating a certain way, when we feel right or wrong depending on how we're eating, right? So it's for me, a diet is diets are the full-on problem. It's just a matter of how are we defining diets, right? Like, a diet doesn't have to be like a commercially defined definition of diet. For me, a diet, if you're judging your performance on food, like judging your performance around food as, like, what makes you good or bad or what makes you right or wrong in that day, you're on a diet.
Okay. And I was reading, I can't remember if I was reading something you'd written recently or I was hearing you talk about it, but you were talking about the difference between sort of like physical deprivation and mental deprivation in regards to food, and you saying that kind of mental deprivation is much worse in your opinion. Can you just sort of like speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, much worse. I don't know if I'll say much worse. I'll say that it's more problematic. It's more often the problem. Because, like, for example, tons of people are, a lot of people physically deprive themselves of stuff for all sorts of reasons. But if that reason isn't shame and judgment and I'm a bad person if I eat that thing, they actually have a decent shot at being able to stick to it, right? So, like, for perfect examples, like celiacs, who don't eat gluten. Like, technically they are restricting themselves from eating gluten. But you don't see celiacs, like, binging on gluten very often. For the most part, like, they are able to actually not eat gluten. And I think that that's because their reaction to eating gluten is not, oh my God, I suck, I fell off the wagon, I'm such a bad person. Their reaction to eating gluten is like, oh shit, now I have to go sit on the toilet, that's really annoying. Or like, I feel sick, that sucks, which are two emotionally and psychologically two very different reactions, right? So, or like another perfect example is like, ethical vegans, right? Like they are ethical vegans who are not eating animal foods for the purpose of like ethics, right? Like a purpose of animal rights, right? Like they are not thinking to themselves, oh my gosh, if I eat that hamburger, like I'm going to be a disgusting fat pig that no one will love. They are actually making that choice. It's a choice. It's like a true choice based out of, reasons that have nothing to do with shame and self-judgment, basically. So I think that like on the one hand, emotional, and I should back up for a second. What is emotional deprivation, right? Emotional deprivation versus physical deprivation. Physical deprivation means like I'm actually sitting on my hands trying not to eat something, right? Like I have taken gluten off the table, I have taken sugar off the table, I am like not like letting myself eat more than however many calories, whatever it is, right? The physical restriction is pretty obvious. Emotional restriction basically means I judge myself for having eaten something or for eating something, right? I feel badly about myself for having eaten something. My self-esteem is attached to something that I've eaten. And that is 90% of the problem for most people, right? Because it's not that hard for people to give up physical restriction. It's not nearly as hard for people. I'll say it's not nearly as hard for people to give up physical restrictions as it is for them to stop feeling guilty and shameful about eating outside of what they think is okay. That is usually much more challenging, right? Like of course there's women who struggle with, introducing foods that they've previously that they've previously disallowed. But the reason for that is the shame and guilt, right? The shame and guilt is really like the sort of driving force behind, all like deprivation and restriction. This feeling of like, oh shit, I'm going to be an unlovable fat pig if I eat this thing. And so I think emotional deprivation, that's what I call basically just like shame and self-criticism and self-judgment for having eaten something, usually on the basis of weight or usually having to do with fears around weight, is much more difficult to deal with. It's the much harder thing to actually address. It's 90% of the problem. And ultimately, I do think that it is a bigger problem than physical restrictions insofar as obviously, if you're starving yourself to death, like that's not going to last very long, / that's incredibly dangerous and bad for you. That's obviously a huge problem. But, a physical restriction like I don't eat gluten because I'm celiac is not inherently a problem. I'm going to try not to eat gluten because it'll make me fat and everyone will, I'll never find a husband is psychologically a completely different thing.
Yeah. And I think where I see this come up when I'm working with people who have kind of really restricted and have kind of been more on the sort of anorexia side as opposed to sort of the binge eating side of things. And I'm kind of being kind of very generalized in what I'm saying here. But often like family members and people from the outside are like, but you started to eat a lot more. You were doing much better. And they're like, well, you're physically feeding yourself. So that should then just translate into this just repairs itself. Right. And then they're saying, well, you know what? I was eating a hell of a lot more, but I hated every moment of it because I haven't then got past the mental side of things.
100%. I think that's a really, really good example, right? Like, an anorexic woman is not healed because she goes to a rehab center and they force feed her. That is not the answer to anorexia, right? Like there is no amount of food you can force feed someone, or there is no amount of food that a person can eat that can heal them of the sort of mental anguish that they're feeling around food. That's the real issue. That's the real dysfunction. That's the real disorder, so to speak.
Yeah. And I think that's where, from my perspective, when I've worked with people who've gone down the sort of more traditional route, that's the bit that seems to be missing a lot, where it's just very much focused on we need to get your calories up, we need you to be eating regularly, and almost like that's the thing that's going to just kind of heal it all.
Right. It's like healing the symptom instead of the problem.
Yeah.
Totally.
In terms of sort of exercise, like what are your thoughts in terms of exercise, in terms of helping someone if they've got issues around sort of food and body and yeah, just kind of that side of things?
I think with exercise, I apply a very similar, if not the exact same attitude to exercise as I do food, which is basically like I teach what I call, quote unquote, intuitive exercise or intuitive movement, which means actually listening to your body about how your body wants to move, what makes it feel good, what doesn't make it feel good. Similarly to intuitive eating, right? Like I encourage my clients to eat what makes them feel physically well. Not that eating something for emotional reasons is wrong, but just again, reteaching the idea that your body is actually giving you biofeedback. You are a mammal. You are an animal. You do not need external people, blog posts, books, pieces of paper, et cetera, to tell you how to eat. And similarly with exercise, I think that, we should be doing what feels good to us physically and doing what feels fun for us and, moving our bodies the way animals move their bodies, instinctivly and naturally. And as far as, sort of the mental and emotional side of things, which is obviously, my greater interest.
Yeah.
I also similarly, talk about exercise the way I would with food, meaning I just wrote this blog post recently and sent it out yesterday. You may have read it. Check your motivations. Are your motivations coming from a place of self-love and compassion, or are they coming from a place of self-hate and I'm not good enough the way I am? If you are, every time you go out for a run, it's because like you think you need to shave off 5 pounds, that's going to probably backfire for you in the long run, emotionally, physically, or otherwise. If you're going out for a run because you just effing love the way your body feels after that run and that endorphin high is really, you're just loving it, takes the stress off, makes your body feel good, makes you feel strong, whatever it is, you're probably going to have a lot more success long term. And I would say that that's, really what constitutes a healthy relationship with exercise.
Yeah. And I think for me, one of the big recommendations I make with someone, especially if they're not naturally drawn towards exercise or they haven't done a lot of exercise, it's like, I want you to think of an exercise that you like really enjoy doing, that if in 6 months' time someone told you there were no health benefits to doing it, you would continue to do that. And whether that
or
be
no weight benefit or no weight related benefits,
but like no sort of health benefits, weight benefits. It's just something that you genuinely love to do, and if you can then be finding that, then that's your place to start.
Totally.
And look, it might be later on that you choose to do things that are going to help in terms of aesthetics if you want to go down that road, but really starting with the stuff that is just kind of fun, making you move your body, etc., is really what people should be focusing on.
Yeah, particularly in the beginning, I think helping people find enjoyment in exercise is really great because I think that, particularly for extreme dieters and people who are coming out of these sort of more dysfunctional relationships with food, I know I certainly kind of hated exercise. I was doing it from a place of self-hate. I was forcing myself to do it all the time.
And there's also those associations you have with exercise from in the past. Totally.
So finding just fun, playful things to do. Like I started taking pole dancing classes and, also I love swimming, just fun things the way I moved my body like I was a kid. I think that's a great place to start. Ultimately, I think that working out for true health benefits is okay. I think that that's actually like a lot of people do that. I think, particularly it can be like a great way to manage all sorts of stuff, cardiac health, diabetes, et cetera. The question is, again, can we separate weight from health? Because I think when it starts to be about weight, it starts to really be more about like body shame and like not feeling good enough and, hating the way we look and not wanting to be seen, et cetera, et cetera. Those kinds of motivations are really, I think, much more problematic. I think that like if you're, running 4 times a week to help manage your diabetes, like I don't necessarily see a problem with that. I think when we conflate weight and health, that's when problems actually start to arise.
Yeah, no, definitely. And so I know sort of body image is a big thing that sort of you talk about. I find that the same thing with clients, but I also think that kind of not just body image, but also just sort of confidence and confidence within yourself. I mean, is that something that you
related?
Look, totally related. I mean, what are some of the ways that you think are great for sort of helping someone sort of build up that confidence within themselves?
Well, and this is actually a really interesting question to be talking about with you, because this is where I actually think that it, gender starts to become a bigger piece of the conversation, right? So a lot of women feel that their only source of worthiness is in the way they look. And women are taught this from a very young age in particular. Not that men don't have this, because they certainly do. And I think, again, in the past 20 years, as the sort of weight discrimination has been skyrocketing, men are more and more affected by this. Again, particularly since the late 80s, early 90s. But ultimately, when you really think about it historically, I think one of the reasons why just pure traditional confidence and body image are so related, it really has to do with where is your sense of self-worth coming from? A lot of women in particular, but again, increasingly men as well, are basically taught from birth that their sense of worthiness comes from the way they look, right? Women historically are valued by their bodies, right? And by their quote unquote beauty, right? How they look is how they are valued as people. Historically, that has been true. We are taught that from a very young age. Every single Disney movie tells us that, right? So I think ultimately, that's really where the connection between just general confidence and body image comes from, is when you're healing your body image issues, one of the things you ultimately have to do, to your point, is actually start to ask yourself, where am I getting my self-worth? If my self-worth is no longer based on the number on the scale, where the fuck is it coming from? And really ask yourself that question, if I don't want to judge myself based on my weight anymore, how am I going to judge myself? Am I going to judge myself based on my ability as a mother, on my career, on just my acts of service and kindness towards other people? Where is my self-worth coming from, if not my looks? And I think that that's a really important question to ask, because ultimately, a lot of women, the reason their body image and their confidence are so highly connected is because they've basically been taught since they were 5 years old that their entire sense of self-worth should be coming from their bodies, should be coming from the way they look, that, people are going to love them because of the way they look, right? They are inherently lovable because of their body size, so that's, I think, sort of the bigger question, is that we need to be asking women, if we're not going to start, if we're not going to look at your body as sort of the sole defining factor of where your self-confidence is coming from, we need to find some other things for you to start, judging yourself on the basis of.
Yeah. And what I find is you can kind of split people, and again, I'm speaking in generalizations, into two categories. And one is the person where, you have got so little going on in all other areas of your life that you really need to kind of get new interests, get new hobbies, sort of build this life where you can get those things. And for other people, and this is quite common, they're people who are achieving everything in terms of their career, women, they're kind of moving up the corporate ladder, they've got the kind of nice relationship, house, car, all of that, but there's no appreciation for those things. And so it's then, okay, how can you then kind of build in that appreciation? And if actually you don't value those things and you're working your ass off to get to a place where you're like, you know what, I don't want any of this stuff anyway. It's what do you then need to be doing, or what is the thing that you really want to be achieving?
Yeah, totally. You can end up having a complete midlife, quarter life crisis, whatever it is. I mean, you can really have sort of a crisis of self when asking these questions, because it really forces you to ask yourself what's important. How do you want to judge yourself? How do you want to be judged by other people? What are your values? It really kind of comes down to a question of what are your values? Yeah. And that's a question that we don't, often ask ourselves.
Yeah. And I think too often people are trying to kind of follow this path that they believe that they should be on, or that they should be doing these things, or these are the things that should be valued, and actually they're not that important to them. And I've actually in my personal life, I've had a number of kind of girlfriends sort of wives of friends, etc., who've just kind of quit corporate jobs and are now doing jobs that they love, and they are just so much happier because they're like, you know what, like I don't care about the money in the way that I thought I would. I don't care about the kind of sense of status of being a lawyer or whatever it may be. It's like, you know what, I want to do something that makes me really happy.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that was certainly my experience. I don't know. Little known fact about Isabel Foxen Duke is that I used to work in finance in corporate America and totally had my quarter life crisis where I quit my job and, you know, babysat and started studying nutrition for no reason. I mean, it was just like I went the other way.
Yeah.
So I get that.
Yeah. And look, I think for a lot of these women, like they're and like yourself, like you will be able to find a good career in whatever you then choose to do. And it might not be the most traditional route, but you're going to be able to then be really successful because they're kind of like really strong women. They're kind of sort of have this real passion anyway.
Yeah, well, I'm substantially more successful in my current career than I think I ever could have been when I was working in finance because I hated it, you know, and I wasn't putting my all into it at all. I was literally just getting by. And, you know, now obviously I work in a field where I'm like totally compelled by my job and, you know, do extra work for no reason. And I think that's, you know, that's really where my success comes from. Like, I just think everyone has a better shot at succeeding at something they actually care about than they ever will at succeeding at something they hate.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess also from my perspective with sort of looking at health is so much of it's not about the food. It's all about sort of all those other things going on in someone's life and them starting kind of just being happy with all of those other areas. It's not about kind of finding the perfect diet.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, again, no one cares about weight in a vacuum. We care about weight because of what we think it means. And we have to really start to ask ourselves, like, what is it that we actually really want underneath our desire to lose weight?
Yeah. I've seen some posts that you've put on your Facebook page about a documentary called Fattitude. I think you've been interviewed as part of this. It looks like really interesting. Can you just sort of tell us some more about it?
Yeah, totally. So Fattitude is a really, really interesting project. It's basically a documentary attacking weight discrimination as a real, like, legitimate form of discrimination, certainly in the United States and increasingly around the world, and really talking about weight bias as something that is incredibly problematic. I think, you know, there's all sorts of instances of this. I mean, I can't speak for really outside of the U.S. Most of my stats are going to come from that. But in the U.S., you know, like, people are being fired for being too heavy. Their health insurance, the amount that they have to pay for health insurance goes up according to their weight. Like, there's all sorts of actual, like, real institutional forms of discrimination that are happening on the basis of size, which are all, obviously, a lot of them are sort of backed up by these claims that, you know, health is attached to weight, which really is, a lot of people are really trying to say, actually, that may not be true. And even if it were true, we have no way to. There's a lot of questioning about how much of our weight is in our control, right? So, like, for example, and are we really all necessarily supposed to be the same weight, right? Like, a lot of these assumptions that, you know, if you're over a certain BMI, then you should pay more for health insurance is based on this idea that we are all supposed to be BMI 25, you know, between like BMIs 21 or 25 or whatever. There's like this very, you know, specific narrow range of what a healthy weight means. And that might not necessarily be true. So this is sort of like a big political conversation that's being had, is this idea of how are we actually potentially discriminating against people for something that they A, necessarily might not be able to control, B, might not necessarily is definitely not a realistic indicator of their health. And there's a lot of incredibly negative and really scary and dangerous implications for this. Like, for example, you know, if a thin person and a fat person go into a doctor's office and they both have diabetes, they both have the exact same, you know, blood sugar levels, one of them will be told, hey, I think that you should, you know, manage your sugar intake and start exercising more. And the other will be told to lose weight. I don't know which is, you know, like, it seems to me that The first is obviously the, much more sane and rational way to handle diabetes, especially considering the fact that people can try to lose weight in lots of unhealthy ways. So there's a lot of different issues involved with weight discrimination. Obviously, I think that weight discrimination is something that happens on a spectrum. Fattitude, the movie, is really focused on plus-sized people in particular. So, in the U.S., that would be like sizes like 14 and up. But I think in general, my perspective, and one of the reasons that they, had me, come and talk in the documentary, is that I see weight discrimination as something, obviously that affects people. And I think they would agree that affects people on a spectrum basis, right? Like somebody who's a size 2 is treated differently than someone who's a size 10, is treated differently than someone who's a size 16 or size 24. We kind of have all sorts of judgments and assumptions that we make about people on the basis of size that, again, may or may not be true. And I think that health is a very important topic of conversation to be had in that. But also, people are being bullied and harassed for their weight. I mean, all sorts of horrible things are happening to people on the basis of size that you would never do to somebody who, say, like, had cancer or was, unhealthy, in quotes, even if that person was unhealthy, which, again, we don't know. So it's really kind of looking at sort of this whole, the various different ways that people are discriminated against on the basis of size that, to some extent, again, might have nothing to do with health, and really challenging, how much of this is really about health and how much of this is really about hate. And that is a really important question for us all to be asking, I think that there's a lot of rationalizing weight discrimination and, what we call fat phobia on the basis of health. Again, we don't necessarily know how much, for lack of a better word, how much weight that really holds. We don't really know how true that necessarily is or how real that really is. And again, it seems in many instances to be a rationalization for bullying, a rationalization for shaming of various kinds. And that's what the documentary is really about. It's really exploring weight bias as like a true form of discrimination that's is kind of taking over the planet right now, unfortunately. I mean, a lot of people have heard this, that weight is sort of like the one socially acceptable form of discrimination left. I don't necessarily know that that's true, because I think that there's still a lot of racism, a lot of homophobia, and a lot of sexism in the world. Yeah. So I'm not sure if I would go so far as to say that, but I've definitely heard that before, and I think a lot of people have. Weight discrimination is certainly a form of discrimination that's really unquestioned and unchecked in our society. And that's what this documentary is really trying to shed light on. And I think that, it's incredibly important. I'm really, really proud to be a part of the movie.
Wow. I mean, that sounds really, really interesting. And do you know when it's going to be out or any of that? I think the last time I saw, they were just about to do some kind of Kickstarter campaign.
They're in their last round of funding. So basically, they've done a couple rounds of funding, mainly to pay for like interviews and travel and all of that jazz. They've now since completed all of their interviews. So they have all of the material they need, but they're in their last round of funding for post-production. So that's what's going on with them right now. They're doing like a huge campaign this summer. It'll be going on basically until September. So I would encourage everyone to go actually check out, I think it's fattitudethemovie.com. I don't know. I wish I had sort of my notes on this so I could really give people a proper place to go check it out. There's an amazing Vimeo trailer that will explain the movie much better than I ever could. And so I would definitely check out the trailer and donate to the Kickstarter. But basically, yeah, they're going to be in hardcore fundraising mode until September. Hopefully they'll hit their goals and make their movie. And then, I would love for this to be out in the next year or two.
Cool. Well, look, I will find the links and I'll put them in the show notes and below this so people can go and access it that way.
Awesome.
So last year you launched a program called Stop Fighting Food, and I know you're about to kind of roll that out again shortly, sometime after summer. Like, for those who don't know about it, like, what is it? What is it all about?
Stop Fighting Food is basically my flagship program. It is the full-on enchilada of everything that I teach. to help women stop feeling crazy around food, particularly women who identify with binge eating and emotional eating. However, I think that, everything I teach can basically be broadly applied to dysfunctional eating across the boards because, like I said, a lot of it comes from the same places and they're all very intertwined. Like a binge eater and an anorectic are actually struggling with a lot of the same root issues, believe it or not. So that's what stop fighting food is sort of like. It's like my holy grail of everything you need to know in order to change your relationship with food permanently. It's 4 months long. It's pretty intensive, the master classes, but there is a free video training series that I offer just to like give everyone out there, for free, an opportunity to really check out my philosophy and sort of my methodology of how I help women go from feeling crazy around food to ending the food craziness once and for all. So if anyone out there is listening, I highly encourage you to go check out the free video training series, which will be officially out in September.
Cool. And where can they go and see that?
StopFightingFood.com.
Okay.
Actually, if this, I don't know when this is going to go up, but if this is going to go up sooner rather than later, you can actually go and register for it right now, and you'll just get an email when it's out. And the trailer is really cool. I really like the trailer. So if anyone thinks that I'm not totally crazy based on this interview, I'd definitely go to StopFightingFood.com and check out the trailer ASAP.
Perfect. Well, I will, again, I'll put the links and everything in the show notes.
Cool.
So apart from just Stop Fighting the Food, like if people want to find out more info about you, where should they be going?
So Stop Fighting Food is a great place to go, especially if you want to see that video training series. IsabelFoxenDuke.com is my blog. And that's really, if you just want some like immediate help, that's the place to go. My blog has like all sorts of blog posts about like my particular perspective on binge eating, emotional eating, feeling crazy around food, body image. It's a pretty spot on resource, I think. Most people find me through my blog at IsabelFoxenDuke.com. I would also suggest, if you like my blog and you think that I'm onto something, sign up for. I have this like little free guide that I give out called "How to Not Eat Cake."
Okay.
Really, actually the full title is "How to Not Eat Cake Really Fast, Standing Up When Nobody's Looking."
Okay.
And I would sign up for that, and then you'll get like weekly coaching emails from me, which are also like really fun and really helpful. And my coaching emails are kind of like my bread and butter. I mean, as far as like that's where people are really getting the most. That's where most of my following seems to be hanging out. That's what they seem to love.
Cool. Well, look, it's been fantastic talking to you today. You have just such a great insight on all of this stuff. I follow your blog all the time. I love reading your stuff. And I'm really looking forward to the Stop Fighting Food program.
Yay, me too.
Cool. Well, look, I hope you have a good rest of your day, and hopefully speak to you soon.
All right, sounds good. Thanks, Chris.
All right, take care.
Thanks for listening to Real Health Radio. If you are interested in more details, you can find them at the 7 Health website. That's www.7, health.com.